Okay, welcome back. This is now a panel about researchers who have OCD and who might be doing research about OCD and some of the implications of this interesting mix that many of us carry around on a daily basis. So for this panel, we are joined by Adib Amin, who is a public health researcher in Bangalore and soon to start a PhD, if I believe, right? I cannot hear you.
Not yet, Elvis.
Okay, so I'm seeing too far away from into the future.
It's in the future, I hope.
We also have Eva Saravi Stepney, who is a PhD researcher at University of Sheffield in history, and Holly Burton, a PhD researcher in psychology at the University of Oxford. So how I like to shape this panel, basically it's like, let's make it as informal as possible. If people have questions, just raise your hand or write it down no, it's better to raise a hand. I think it's better to raise a hand. And then we'll just start to talk about things and see where the discussion goes. So let's start with like a very general question. Like, when you think about OCD and doing research, what are some of the parallels that you see between the two processes where you're like, oh my God, doing research is so like OCD, or, not at all?
Yeah,
you go.
That's quite a difficult question, Elvis, and not something that I've thought about directly. And I suppose I don't want to kind of perpetuate the stereotype that we were kind of discussing yesterday about perhaps being obsessive making you a more kind of productive worker. But I do think personally, I don't know what this is like for the others, that there is a sense of thoroughness in research, and this has been something that's been both kind of a hindrance to me and something that I think has made me quite like analytic in my research, is that I always want to find what I always want to kind of discover what the picture is, which means I'm incredibly detailed. But my supervisor has said to me over and over again, stop trying to solve everything. Stop trying to find the answer for everything. Some of this stuff is messy. You have to accept that it was messy at the time, because I'm looking at a historical period and looking at kind of the psychological knowledge being produced at the time. You have to accept that the links that people made aren't always there, instead of me constantly trying to find, okay, but why did this psychologist in the 1970s say, that behaviors were a response to stimulus, but doesn't talk about the stimulus, and my supervisor will be like, oh, it's because, often people actually don't explain everything. So I think in that sense, the desire for certainty within my own research and the desire for certainty in my kind of own life, and how as an academic, I'm often being told that you have to just, especially in a PhD when it's so long, you don't know everything at the beginning. Stop trying to pretend, stop trying to, have that kind of sense that you do. So I don't know if that answers the question. Sorry, it's quite rambly.
Just to kind of add to that, I think, would it be helpful if we the three of us kind of said vaguely how we've kind of like progressed through our research and with like OCD, because I kind of think that kind of talks about how in parallel. I mean, so my first degree was in psychology. I'm actually not doing a PhD in psychology right now. I'm doing a PhD in population health. I might get told off by my supervisors if I don't correct that. So during my first degree, I hadn't really thought very much about OCD or like studying OCD until my final year, when I decided I was going to do a module on the neurobiology of mental illness, and I was given the prospect of having to sit in a lecture theatre and learn what was wrong with my brain, which triggered basically like a 48-hour panic attack, at which point I decided that if I was going to continue doing that module, which I really wanted to do, it was actually one of my favourite modules during my undergrad, that I needed to access some therapy as soon as possible, which then meant that I then spent the next year preparing to do this exam essentially. And I think, although I see my journey very much shaped by OCD, because I don't think I'd be sat here talking about it. I wouldn't be doing perinatal OCD research if I didn't have OCD, but I very much see that as a turning point for both my own personal development in terms of getting over OCD, because I've had it since I was a child, but it wasn't diagnosed until I was 17. I had therapy then, but it was rubbish. It was terrible, in fact. I'd say, yeah, it made things worse. And until this, I had this module, I hadn't accessed therapy for like 5 years. I was 22 at that point, and that was a real turning point for me in my therapeutic journey as well as my academic journey. I wouldn't say that I think about my work as having be benefited from OCD. I actually see it completely separately, and it's just something that I live with alongside of it. And also, you know, I've got this experience that I can understand the kind of the perspectives and the experiences more from the participant, although I did intentionally, I think, decide to do a topic which I don't have full experience of. I've never been pregnant, and so that means I'm kind of like one step away from it. So the parallels aren't identical to me, I think. I don't know about what you think, Adip.
Thanks, Eva and Holly for that. Yeah, I think I can relate to what you said just now, Holly, with respect to trying to kind of gauge your own experiences with OCD and the way in which your research has evolved over the years. I did my first degree in economics, and then I went to London to actually study quantitative political science, which I'm not involved in at all now. And while there, my kind of and I was diagnosed about 2 months before I went for my degree, and for some reason, and so a lot of my OCD has to do with intrusive thoughts. Like I have a lot of intrusions, and morality was a huge and continues to be a huge aspect of those intrusions. So I switched degrees to moral and political philosophy, I think, to, in a sense, also in a sense, in an act of compulsion, which I now see as compulsion, actually, where you have obsessions and you have intrusions and you try to manage them via compulsions. And actually, academics and analytical philosophy in particular was a huge moment of compulsion, where the discipline of analytical philosophy is mainly Anglo-American. It tries to emphasize clarity. It tries to emphasize conclusivity. There's a certain linearity to analytical philosophy where you try to solve moral problems. And that's, and anybody who has intrusions tries to often think their way out of intrusions. That's the first impulse. At least that was a trigger for me. And analytical philosophy therefore played a huge role in structuring that particular academic experience. Though I must say, it did not do me any good, because as OCD often is, obsessions do get in the end, if you're trying to fight your intrusions and wrestle them with your thoughts, they just tend to get more and more, I guess, powerful, or at least they get a lot more institutes. They can bypass your cognitive and intellectual systems in a lot of ways. And I didn't have therapy at the time because like Eva talk yesterday, where there was a distinction between obsessions and compulsions, my psychiatrist clearly told me that you have obsessions, so I'm going to give you 100 mg of SSRIs, and you don't need talk therapy because only people with compulsions have talk therapy. But he didn't see my academic and my kind of obsessions with morality as compulsions. So, exactly what you said yesterday, Eva, in your presentation, the history of this dichotomy. And then I moved to I moved back to Bangalore, and that's when I started studying, I started doing urban studies where there is no clear, and it was a moment of, I think, it was a moment of great relief, if not therapy, because where I studied, urban studies in Bangalore, Indian Institute for Human Settlements, my professors constantly emphasized messiness and the idea that a sort of rationalistic or technocratic way of thinking often perpetuates, forms of injustices, right? That's the form of forms of injustices. It kind of like, when we talk about crime, you have the immediate idea is to have the idea of security, which is clear, visible, and that often perpetuates crime itself, right? And so that was a moment of a metaphorical kind of relationship, or a parallel that I had with this, which was quite revealing to me, that it's okay not to kind of I guess solve things, or be solutionistic, or be positivistic, or try to kind of clear out the space. And that was I think a dialectical process. And I don't work, I mean, on OCD. I mean, I think I'm a public health researcher, and I do want to work on questions of spatiality and madness, and also how the ways in which capitalism also, the relationship between capitalism and disability, for example. So that's my brief. Sorry if it was a bit long, but that was the kind of parallel moves that I came to.
I was just going to add to Adeep's, when you're talking about the kind of analytic philosophy and the kind of compulsive aspect of doing the kind of traditional empiricism, which is, all the Russell Group universities in Britain anyway, that's the type of philosophy that you do. It reminded me that I have often thought that some of the difficulties that I have around, or have had around, kind of intrusive thoughts, intolerance of uncertainty, excessive and persistent doubt in terms of the reality of things, or whether my parents are really my parents, and so on, all these kind of questions that you can get into, is very rooted in the type of education that I had in like a British school, where so I also did philosophy at A-level. It was very empirical, it was very analytical. Throughout my career in history and my undergrad, it was always, you find the evidence for something, you find the evidence against it, you come up on one side, you present a coherent conclusion, and that really analytic way of thinking, yes, served me really well in academia up until I developed incredibly kind of taboo related intrusive thoughts, and then had to drop out of university completely, and didn't think I'd ever go back. So obviously it was a massive hindrance, but yeah, I do often think, if we had a different type of education system that, like Adeep said, was focused more about kind of the complexity and messiness of things, whether that would be helpful for people who like us perhaps want to constantly categorize and solve and find certainty in regards to all of our experiences.
What is interesting is that you talked especially about the you doing research, feeding your own intrusive thoughts and obsessions, and but when I think about me, so I mostly had intrusive thoughts about sexuality, and reading about queer theory was such a big trigger. I remember the first year I was just completely avoiding that class, although I actually wanted to take it, but I was like, hell no, way too triggering. But then there wasn't a moment where I was like, okay, use it as an exposure exercise. where like my PhD at the end, it became a self-exploratory thing and an exposure thing, I guess, to the point where now I can just read whatever I want and it just doesn't affect me anymore. So I was wondering whether you also had like those moments, you know, when doing research where you were like, okay, I know it is extremely scary, but I'll do it anyways because I know that it will be a good thing for me.
Yeah, I'm happy to go again. I think yeah, I think that battle is definitely constant. I like Holly with her kind of perinatal OCD. I have some distance in terms of my own experiences in the fact that my work's historical. So for my master's, I looked at obsessional thoughts in the early 20th century, so kind of 1900s to 1950s. And that created kind of a big separation from the model of OCD that we have today. But I do think researching OCD and having OCD, you're constantly coming up against things that are a form of exposure. I mean, even going to this kind of conference for the first time is a level of, in the 2017 one, you know, it's a level of suddenly being confronted with all these different types of thoughts that people have, and all your kind of worst fears being presented in front of you. And it's very healing in that respect, but it also is exposing. But I think I'll probably feel similar to you once I've got a bit further into the PhD, Elvis. I think because I focused, like Adeep said, have focused in my research so far on the kind of distinction between obsessions and compulsions, and then the kind of research around compulsions. I haven't quite got onto the research around obsessions and intrusive thoughts, and that's where I'm going next. And I think that because it's intrusive thoughts in the way that we understand them today is going to be incredibly exposing. And
I think in a similar way with what Elvis was saying about the kind of avoidance, that was definitely something that was at the beginning of when I was exploring OCD in like a research point of view. But then I think, so when I was doing my final year of my undergrad, my best friend who also has OCD, just coincidentally, had a baby, which is kind of what triggered me to then think, ooh, let's look at some of the literature, because I know that she had an appalling experience of pregnancy, and she wouldn't mind me talking about that. That then kind of triggered me to look at it. But then at the same time, I was experiencing the fact that when this baby was born, and I love this child very much, I started getting intrusive thoughts like new parents might get. You know, I was worried that I had a nightmare, what now 5 years ago, that I put her in my backpack and suffocated her, which I think about all the time still. But not it doesn't distress me now, but then when I'm reading papers where, because I mean I have to read lots of papers about perinatal OCD, where there's women who are worrying that they're going to put their baby in a microwave, that they're going to stab their baby, they're going to molest their child, kind of things. It's now got to the point where I see it so much, I mean, other than the fact that sometimes, I mean, and I think anybody reading these papers would find it distressing, because some of the things that happen to these women is absolutely appalling and incredibly distressing, and people in general with OCD. But it's much easier to kind of be less impacted by the OCD just because I've been exposed to it so much, which is exactly what ERP is supposed to do. So, you know, it worked.
Yeah, I think you know, I think of exposure, you know, independently of, I mean, you know, I think of exposure as experience, in terms of just living a life, because you know, I've had conversations with people who've often asked very similar questions to what Eva just, I mean, Eva's you know, academic asked her, and so you know, it's not, it's a constitutive part of life, of living, I think, with OCD, where people, where you're going to have experiences that are going to be triggering every day, right? They're going to be minor triggers, you know, and some days they're going to be major triggers, right, which you're going to remember a lot, and that's going to be part of your archive and your repository of triggering experiences that are going to, I think, give give you some sort of experience and I guess a bulwark against future such triggers, right? So the hope, I think, also is that in living, that we'd get accustomed to triggering experiences, and it would get better. First, I remember the first time, I mean, like I've been diagnosed now back, and certain traumatic moments, right? The moment when you're diagnosed, and when you're initially diagnosed, or when you have when, I mean, I've read accounts of women who just given birth, who have very triggering experiences of being young parents, and so on and so forth. So that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say is that academics, I guess, doesn't have much to do with exposure as much as living does.
Yeah. Poppy, you have your virtual hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, well, this whole conversation is really kind of personally enlightening, important, so thank you. I wanted to ask, talking about kind of academic and kind of exposure to academia, and I realise this is potentially a very personal question, so if you don't want to answer, please say, but whether in therapy academia has ever come up as something that you talk about with the therapist, and I was wondering if the therapist, especially if you're researching OCD, what their responses have been, and if that's kind of changed the therapy in any way.
So I've been having cognitive behavioural therapy for the last 5 years with the same therapist, which I'm very lucky to have, and the last year or so, I've not really, I've not needed CBT. It's kind of just like, a monthly appointment just to check in. And the whole point of that is because my supervisors want me to continue seeing someone because of my OCD, in case that it is impacting my work and, me in general, because they realize that doing this work can be triggering, and which I think has been really important, just to kind of keep on top of it. I mean, I talk to my therapist literally about every single thing, from sex to academia to, I don't know, friendships from when I was like 16, like everything, which is very useful for lots of things, but specifically about academia. She's never mentioned that she was. I don't think she's ever been concerned about the fact that I'm studying OCD. I think she's just been very supportive and supported me through deciding this is what I wanted to do, which is totally appropriate for a therapist. But she's not said, "Oh, Holly, do you think that's a bit like, seems a bit that you want to be doing too much information about that?" But that's never come up.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Poppy. I mean, it's not. I had therapy from like age 17 to 23, 24, and I didn't start researching OCD until I was 25. So I kind of have gone the therapy window, although I have, stayed on medication as kind of stabilizing force. So I don't really have the experience of having therapy whilst being engaged in this academic work. Although I do have a mentor who is provided through the disability service, who I see every week, but it's kind of informal. It's not therapeutic as such. And I have actually, over the last few months, been trying to educate her about OCD more, because she knew from my notes that it was something that I experienced and had difficulty with. But when this thing came up with another academic and I was quite distressed about it, she didn't fully understand. So I sent her, the video of David Veal and Rose Cartwright talking about intrusive thoughts that Elvis actually sent me, and various other kind of informative tools. And then the next session I saw her, she was like, "Oh my God, I had absolutely no idea that this was what OCD was." And she was kind of almost like ashamed, but not in a way that she should have been, just in a way that, you know, society hasn't explained fully what OCD is. And she was like, you know, like, I'm so sorry that you've had to go through this. And that was quite amazing, I think, actually, just having that. I mean, it's obviously upsetting that people don't automatically know or understand, and there are so many stereotypes about OCD, but it was also really, yeah, to see that, because I was so worried when I sent her the video that she was going to be like, oh, you are so weird for having these strange thoughts. You know, I was so petrified after I sent it. I kept checking my emails every day to see whether she'd responded to the video. And so then having her in the next session say, you know, this must be so hard, was really wonderful. And since then, it's been much more like an open conversation. But also another thing that kind of Holly brought up, this of, you know, your supervisors wanting you to continue have therapy whilst working in this thing, is something that is difficult about academia in regards to having experience and studying something that you experience, because the way that academia is structured, you know, you have 3 years to complete 100,000 words, you have all these milestones. When actually, if you've got experience with experience of something like OCD and are studying OCD, perhaps you need more time, you need more space, you need periods out, you need reflection. Or if you're dealing with any kind of difficult material, if you're a researcher on sexual violence, a researcher on, you know, all these kind of difficult topics, the way that kind of especially in the UK, like the marketization of higher education, and the way it's constantly wanting people to produce stuff within X amount of time, and you're not allowed any extra funding. And, you know, I haven't been offered funding for therapy or anything like that. If I wanted it, I have to pay for it myself. You know, there's not in higher education, there needs to be more advocacy in terms of getting the system to work in favor of people having experience conducting that research. And at the moment, it's skewed against us. And I think that that's something that's like really important for us as academics in OCD to actually acknowledge and be like, well, how do we widen this and make it more accessible?
Sorry, just quickly to add to what Eva was saying there, I literally hadn't occurred to me until just now that doing this kind of research is more, you know, there's something inherently distressing about it. Whereas, you know, if I was doing a degree where it wasn't, I don't know, let's say physics, where, you know, I'm not looking, you wouldn't be reading transcripts of incredibly distressing interactions with people where they're telling things that are, you know, about, you know, suicide or like, you know, harm things. Like, there is a difference between that and continuing in academia is weird. Doing a PhD is weird. But having OCD is weird. And having OCD whilst doing a PhD is really weird. Like, and also, especially if you're also researching OCD, like, it just is going to be inherently distressing. And I think Eva's right when she says that there isn't things in place. It hadn't occurred to me that I could have might need time to you know, or why that might explain why I'm tired all the time. Well, partly anyway. I'm sure it's lots of other reasons, not going to sleep, for example. But you know, that maybe being kinder to ourselves about, you know, not producing work at the same rate necessarily as everybody else is all the time. Like, I think that would be reasonable.
Adib, do you want to add something? Is he still among us?
Maybe frozen.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. My internet is quite unstable. I would like to kind of go back to what Eva, I missed some of the conversation, I'm sorry. I would like to go back to what Eva said about the marketization of higher education and the idea, you know, that you have to complete it in 3 years' time, and the kind of the scores and the, you know, the matrices, which has also kind of, in a sense, infiltrated academia and generally in life, right? That you know, it kind of reminds me of this of this Instagram page that a friend of mine had sent me called Neuro Emergent. I think that by Marta Rose. It's called Neuro Emergent Time, where Rose talks about how you know, living in capitalistic time and living in factory time is linear. You know, it's positivistic in the sense that everything has to be measurable. It relies on the idea of visible productivity. and it is sort of defines that productivity in terms of economic and what visible measures, right? And I think in the academic system and generally in the world also, right, there is this we're living in factory time, even in academia, right? And so you have to normatively kind of arrange your mind and your senses and yourself to that linearity, right, which doesn't work for many of us, and it can also perpetuate a sense of disorder, right, pathologization also of the feeling, not just of what you have but also of how you're spending time, right? And so like, I know this is a broader critique of capitalism in a sense, but I think it's worth doing when we think about experiences of OCD and mental illness in general. Um, yeah, So I mean, looking at the relationship with time, where our shame also is kind of entangled with time in that sense. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Mariam, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Hi. Sorry, my video is not on. I'm just being lazy in bed this morning. And I want to just first thank everyone so much for being super honest. And yeah, this is my first time coming to this conference, and it's just been really amazing because I like the OCD part of me is definitely the part that, I'm almost 26 now, has been like the last thing for me to come to terms with and like admit to myself. Like, I found dealing with bipolar disorder to somehow be even like less taboo, which, not that there's a hierarchy of suffering or mental illness, but I definitely find people find this the more weird part of me. And so I guess the question from there is, how do you navigate disclosure in your personal life, in your academic life, with peers, with profs, and not just in the context of doing your research on OCD, but also maybe like if you've disclosed when it beyond that? Because sometimes I find if you are doing the research now, I mean, this is not entirely true, but now at least there's some understanding that lived experience is important and valuable. So disclosing in that context can somehow be more justified. But if you're not disclosing in that context, I find it can be just like still just like this weird freak thing.
That is, I'm just going to jump in. That is a very good question. That was actually going to be my next question, to disclose or not to disclose. And personally, like, so I am doing research about sexual orientation OCD, and I had an experience of it. So I, like, in my field, I become like the OCD guy. Like, oh yeah, he's the linguist doing, so it has like that capitalist label, like, in the academic market, which is useful. But then at the same time, like, I found myself sometimes when I present at conferences, and there was this one time where I was presenting what exactly sexual orientation OCD was and all the misunderstandings, and then I was providing like some explanations, like just debunking the myths of sexual orientation OCD. And then if I have someone in the audience from the LGBT community, they understandably so, like, they take it very, harshly, like, oh, HOCD, homosexual OCD, that's like a repathologization of homosexuality. And then I find myself in those moments where I'm like, okay, I just spent 20 minutes explaining how it's not a pathologization. So I use my, disclosing card and then explain like the whole more personal aspect. And once, like, yeah, like I received even like really like harsh attacks, like, oh, you're being homophobic and blah blah. And so during those moments, like, it's really hard, to actually accept that feedback and that critique, despite me actually trying to, explain as good as I can what it is and what it's not. But then I think, like, at the end of the day, it's really like a question of is it useful to disclose? What are the effects, the potential effects of the disclosure, depending on the type of intrusive thoughts that you might experience? Because like, like, let's say about like, you know, pedophilic intrusive thoughts, like I'm always one of the first saying, don't just disclose this like openly, because the consequence of it for somebody who doesn't understand that will be like extremely violent. And I met many people who were incarcerated, who lost family, and horrible things. So yeah, I'm wondering what other people think about this.
Yeah, I think with disclosure, you have to, in a sense, be. I mean, at least I've been measured. Like, I'm open about having OCD, but I'm not completely open with people about what the contents of my intrusions and compulsions are. Because I've had experiences where people in, advisors and people in what you may say in power have often looked at me in an accusing sort of way, in terms of, if I talk about my intrusions, right? That, oh, you're talking about, and you're talking about, say for example, sexual intrusions, and they would, like, because sexual intrusions are, and I think about OCD as, as a dichotomy between purity and danger, where people where there is a taboo that's attached to danger, and people with OCD often have that dichotomy and that tension very strongly in their everyday life. And so it's deeply structured by your social context and your surrounding, right? And so the fact that you have certain types of intrusions are often a reflection of uh, certain certain things that are considered to be pure, or certain things that are considered to be dangerous, right? And so I guess I'm just being long-winded right now, but what I'm trying to say is also trying to be a lot more, trying to gauge the other person's sort of awareness of of uh, of OCD, or trying to introduce them slowly to OCD, where you give them examples and stuff like that, and then you sort of talk about your experience. What Eva spoke about, where she sent her, the person that she talks to, the video, that explains, that talks about OCD, right? In an, and so you do that, you perform it. I mean, unfortunately, the burden of education falls on you. That's the world we're living in right now when it comes to OCD, because not many people are aware about say sexual intrusions as being part of OCD. There's a danger of you immediately getting pathologized or criminalized even. And I've known examples where people have had to, have had terrible consequences because of their revelation. So I would say, yeah, it's important. I mean, I'm trying to, also trying to make you anxious about this. I want to be careful about not making you anxious about this, and trying to also, pathologize OCD itself as something that you'll have to worry about constantly in your life. But trying to kind of also introduce trying to be strategic in your in the way in which you reveal your OCD about, is something that you'll have to like consider. Yes, do consider that. Do the education bit, send them videos, talk about it in an abstract sort of way, and then you can talk about material depending on their reaction. So you'll have to pay attention to that. Sorry, it's a little bit, it's a little bit advisey, but sorry about that. But yeah, it's a very personal question as well.
Sorry, I think I've had a bit of a different experience than Elvis and Adeep. Just I think partly perhaps the fact that I'm a woman, and if I was describing having certain thoughts about my best friend's baby and things, that if I don't come across as necessarily a threat, whereas some people might do, just because because of kind of prejudice and biases and things. But also I would say that, so since I was 17, I have been so open about having OCD, almost to the point where you could point and say, that seems a bit obsessive, Holly. I think everybody in my personal life knows that I have OCD, and have done since I was a child. I would openly talk about it, more of a teenager than a child. And now at least I have a reason for disclosing it, whereas before I'm not sure I did. Where, you know, now I could, you know, if I'm on a date or meeting friends or whatever or something, and someone says, oh, what, you know, what's your PhD? And I could be like, oh, I study perinatal OCD. And then often the next question is, oh, how come? And then I can be like, oh, I've got OCD, and also, you know, I've got this experience of my best friend having a baby and then wanting to learn literature. That makes a lot more sense than me just kind of like almost having actually I do own a badge that says I've got OCD. But, you know, like that I made that decision as an adult, but when I was a teenager, I kind of almost obsessively told people, because then it explained why there was, you know, like it was quite obvious I was something wrong with me. You know, just, you know, I was a weird kid, and that this kind of explained things. And then also just a second point that, so I think so Eva mentioned the David Veal and Rose Cartwright in talk at the OCD Action. Was it OCD Action in 2019? So I was also there, and I remember someone saying to David Veal, so David Veal was talking about something, I can't remember what it was, and somebody in the audience said, do you have OCD? And he then said no, and the person in the audience very much was like, okay, well, I don't trust what you're saying then. And I think disclosing and having OCD in the OCD community, when the experiences of OCD are so, I think, just difficult to understand from an outside perspective, that having OCD in academia is an advantage to doing this research. And I can understand why people would be hesitant to listen to the, you know, middle-aged, middle-class white man in a white coat. Still, like I think the fact that almost everyone at this conference has got OCD, who's talking at the conference in academia, and we're you know, hopefully going to be people who are going to continue doing OCD research, is really powerful. I don't know if I really don't know if other mental health disorders have the same kind of activistic, that's not a word, is it? Activist and personal experience, lived experience, as the OCD community seems to just randomly have.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Miriam. I think it's a difficult one, as kind of the previous people have said. I think, like Holly, I'm almost more open about my OCD now that I'm studying a PhD in it, because things follow that progression as well. What are you studying? What are you doing PhD? What are you studying OCD? Why? You know, disclose. But I also understand why you say that, you know, it's that kind of, people see it as that more weird aspect of you, and our Deep's thing, you know, that about kind of purity and danger, and often OCD forms itself around topics which are considered flashpoints, particularly dangerous flashpoints within society, particularly kind of difficult things to talk about. Some of the reasons that they are so distressing is because they're not commonly discussed topics or ideas. And I think that we still have a lot of work to do as a community to really change society, even though, as Adeep said, you know, you don't want to make people anxious and say, you know, don't discuss it, but in terms of being, I've never disclosed really the content of my intrusive thoughts. I've never really enclosed that I have intrusive thoughts either, like that aspect of OCD. I just, when I say I have OCD, I just let people kind of, you know, understand that as they want. I don't try and necessarily engage in the conversation further, because I'm not comfortable yet with where that might go and the kind of reactions that people may have. I think the lived experience aspect of my research is slightly different, because in history, lived experience still isn't seen as very important in historical work. You know, I'm the only PhD student doing a history of mental health, let alone the history of OCD. It's not a common topic for historical study. So to throw lived experience in with that, as well as like having to explain what OCD is, what's the point of doing a historical study of it, is just kind of, yeah, a lot. And I think, yeah, I mean, I do just think, as Adeep said, we have a lot of work to do, and it shouldn't fall on us, but there is still so much groundwork in kind of helping society really understand what OCD is. And I think this is why conferences like this is so important, because it builds that kind of foundation and that community for being able to articulate and work through things and then kind of express them in order to change kind of the general discourse around what OCD is and what it's like to experience it. I hope that makes sense and that answers your question.
Great. So we have roughly 12 minutes left, and I would like to wrap this up on like a positive vibe. So we talked a lot about, you know, the negative consequences of OCD and doing research and that kind of thing. And I was wondering, like, what would be, you know, one of the positive aspects of having OCD and being in academia that you would identify, and also whether your research has changed your understanding of OCD in personal ways. So like when I think about myself, like without the OCD, I wouldn't be in London. I wouldn't be doing a PhD. Like despite all the suffering that I went through, at the very end, the OCD gave me so much back, you know, like all the, well, meeting all you beautiful people, you know, going on television to play a song, like, you know, like all these big things that I did thanks to the OCD. And then also during my research, I stopped seeing OCD like as this very menacing monster that tries to attack me, but more in terms of it's a protection. Like it is trying to protect me from some danger. So like, because like, so the PhD office was right by a canal, and every time that I would walk along the canal, I was having the intrusive thought of falling down, you know, and then I was like, oh my God, like this is like how intrusive thought works. It's like they signal you what you should not do in order to protect a part of yourself, be that your life, your identity, your moral standing, whatever is important to you. And once I start to think about OCD in terms of like a protection, that really like helped me to embrace that side of the OCD and not seeing it as a monster. But again, like it's a very like personal thing that I came up with. So I'm wondering what you all think about that, and also like you know what were your own understandings of the OCD?
I'm afraid I don't think I see things as quite positively, so I probably should go first to get it out of the way. I mean, I don't see myself as having, you know, special powers or like skill set or anything. But I mean, one thing it has given me is a career. I suspect if I didn't have OCD, I would probably have continued. I might have done a PhD in psychology, doing something else, maybe about memory. I don't know. The one thing it has, I think, given me is kind of more space to want to listen to other people's experiences and understand them, both, I guess, from my academic work, but also just in personal life. Yeah, I've done mental health training and things, and maybe I wouldn't have done that if I didn't have mental health problems myself. But I am I'd be a bit hesitant to say almost like, you know, a thank you to the OCD, because it definitely like I'm not a fan. I wouldn't recommend to a friend, even though it has, you know, had these smallish positive-ish aspects. I'm grateful that I'm here doing this PhD, and I'm grateful for, you know, meeting everybody, but it's not, I wouldn't say it was a positive take.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend OCD to a friend, but I would say that studying OCD and having experience of OCD is really, really amazing, in the sense that I feel often when I talk to you guys, and Adeep, Elvis, Matt and I, you know, we discuss readings, and we're part of this space that's both kind of like experiential and really kind of highly critical, and it's the most kind of like fruitfully academic space I've ever been in and I've ever found myself in, because it's not purely thinking and it's not purely experiencing. It's just that wonderful kind of mixture of both of those things. And I think thinking about it, even though it was like having intrusive thoughts and getting into that spiral and difficulty is so painful, thinking about OCD all the time. I mean, I will say that I'm like most of the time these days, like I wouldn't class myself as being unwell, and I do think that makes a big difference. But thinking about OCD all the time and having the opportunity to think about OCD all the time is incredibly rewarding. Like I feel like I understand myself so well. I feel like I understand like kind of the intricacies of my experience, the way that it relates to other people's experiences. Like I just don't feel like I know anything as well as I know like OCD, and in terms, and like, yeah, and just kind of the challenges that come with studying it and having the opportunity to study it and think about it all the time is so liberating, in that I don't feel so scared of myself. I don't feel that there are so many parts of me that are really unknown. I feel like I can actually think and engage. I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of hard to explain. No, yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you, Eva.
No, go ahead, go.
Like Holly and Eva said, like I don't think of OCD in terms of its positivity, but it's I guess an affective, also a cognitive feature that it's part of me, right? It's something that I view the world through every single day, every single moment. And the thing with OCD is vigilance. You are always vigilant. I mean, you're always looking. I don't want to talk about it as some sort of like superpower or something that gives me an extra a sixth sense or anything, like that type. But it does. It's sort of in its, I think in its own in the experiencing of it. Like I have become. I have educated myself a lot, like Holly said, in terms of I didn't know anything about like mental health or mental illness before I was diagnosed, and that compelled me to read up a lot on mental health and mental illness, and to pay attention to other people's experiences. My own relationship to my family, for example, has changed, right? I understand my family's history so much better. Like, what was happening at certain points of time, things become clearer to you when you're engaging with what's with the psychological side of things. So I guess it's definitely brought some like understanding about things. And also I guess because trying to delineate like what is it about OCD, right, like that presents itself to me as purity and danger. And I guess, like in some sense, Mary Douglas's book Purity and Danger has become almost, and it's the first book we read, by the way, like Matt, Eva, Elvis, and I, and that's become a deeply like important way in which to understand, for example, relationship between cleanliness and uncleanness, order and disorder, right? That features so much in our world today, especially also with COVID, for example, right? So I guess, yeah, it's brought in a lot, I guess, ways to look at the world. But again, like I said, it's deeply painful. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I hope I don't have a worst enemy, but I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
Yeah, so like just to clarify, so I never said, that I wanted to wish this on anybody, because it is definitely horrible.
I didn't think you meant that. I'm sorry for implying that you said that. I didn't mean to.
but like, I just thought, like, human beings are automatically biased towards the negative. Like our minds just like, oh, negative, that's the end of the world. Like, and it's so hard sometimes to shift a little bit to the light. So I really want to try to do that.
Honestly, it was really nice hearing, your guys' take on kind of the positive aspects. I mean, it really has made me think, so that maybe I'm being too negative about it. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
So Matt, do you have a short question, or let's run out a little bit over time? That's fine.
Just a very short question, maybe just kind of a wrap-up question, that if there's, for people who are here that are maybe thinking about going into academia or in their own programs, do you have just a brief piece of advice, if there's kind of one thing that you knew going in, or you'd like to share for them to help them succeed?
Find out what the mental health provisions at your university are and set them up as soon as possible. So if you're starting your undergraduate degree, make sure that you know how to ask for extra time handing in papers and things, and making sure that you've basically got all of the things you could possibly be needing before you need them. So I always set them up a month before I arrive at university. That's a lie. I didn't do that for my PhD. I've now got a situation where I'm 6 months late, but that's fine. Other people should do it. That's what I did for my undergrad and my master's. And it definitely helps having that just as a backup, and you know where to go. So if you are in crisis, you know where to go before you're in crisis, and just how university works.
I'd say have your kind of community, have your people that you're honest about OCD with. We're all here today, a kind of wonderful community, and I think kind of grounding yourself in that. But I don't have any space like this within my university. This is kind of a created space that's something extra, but it's actually so integral. And so I think, find a community in terms of OCD if you're studying OCD. If you're an academic with OCD, studying OCD, find your OCD community that you can discuss things with, ground yourself within, because that's really been kind of life-saving for me.
Yeah, I have nothing new to add. What Holly and Eva said, I would like to reiterate what they said. Find out the mental health services in the university that you're going to, because the thing about it is you don't know when you're going to be triggered and when you might need help. And when you are triggered and when you need help, as we all know, it's very difficult to ask for help. And so just look out for those things. Make sure you establish those connections when you get there. The second thing is, of course, what Eva said about community, right? Try to find people who in your own cohort, I guess, who I guess the good thing about today is that a lot more people are open about their struggles. I think what COVID also has done is that it has, in some sense, normalized psychological struggle, right? And so I'm hoping that this would also lead to more conversations and less taboo when it comes to opening up. But yeah, find people in your community, but also some always universities, there are people working on mental health. They have try to meet faculty who've worked on OCD, for example, in your university, and talk to them, establish those connections as well. I don't think I have anything new to, particularly anything unique to add, which is fine. But what Holly and Eva said, and it's good that Matt and Elvis and a lot of people here have created a space where we can talk, which is great. So also, if you need to reach out, don't hesitate to reach out. Yeah.
I am actually going to add something, and I totally agree with what has been said. But I'm just going to add that academia is a poisonous gift. So what do I mean by that? Is it is extremely rewarding intellectually, but at the same time, the academic system is like the devil's work. It wants you to produce. And then they say, oh, but take care of your mental health, but they don't really provide anything for your mental health. So it's really up to you to come up with some sort of strategy that, allows you to keep really healthy mentally. So like for me, it was really having fixed working hours so that I can take off Saturday and Sunday, right? And everybody works differently. Everybody has their own ways of being productive during the day. Some people work best at night, others in the morning, others in the afternoon. You really have to find this. But it is really important to really be conscious of the evil side of academia and all the pressures that you know puts onto your shoulders, because it is really, really, really tough. And even worse if you have, you know, mental health issues that you have to fight with every single day. I'm not discouraging everybody to go to academia. It's just be aware of those pressures and try to find your community and your strategies and how to deal with the whole pressure. Yeah. Cool. So on that note, thank you very much, Holly, Eva, and Adib, for the lovely conversation we had. So now we are going to have a long break of an hour because our next speakers, because we're like, you know, doing things across time zones, we had to arrange everything in a way that would fit everybody. So what I suggest to you is that for those who want to take a whole hour break, do it. Come back later on the other Zoom link. And for others who want to, you know, continue the conversation, let's meet on the Wonder platform. I just put the link in the chat, and yeah, we can continue the talk and see what other insightful things we come up with.
And I'll just add real quick, the next panel, I think like this one will be very interesting. We're going to talk about film. Robert Lemelson, who's an anthropologist, has done some really amazing work on OCD in Indonesia and how to think about OCD cross-culturally and also represented in film. And then Elvis is going to talk about his experiences on Switzerland's Got Talent. And then Chris Bear, who did Unstuck, the OCD Kids movie, which is really just a great movie about, you know, OCD. So come on if you have the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.